Okay, thank you so much. So now we try to share all this. For 20 years, I have worked on the theme of death, dying, grief, and palliative care. My research focuses especially on how people represent death and how these representations influence psychological suffering, mourning, resilience, and the relationship between patients, families, and the healthcare professionals. I also work on death education and grief education projects for healthcare professionals, educators, and patients. Today, the study of death and dying is becoming more and more important all over the world. A very significant contribution comes from the Lancet Commission on the Value of Death. The Commission explains that modern societies have tried to remove death from daily life and to place it mainly inside hospitals and healthcare institutions. For this reason, many people are not prepared to face fragility, illness, dependence, and mortality. The Lancet literature also highlights the importance of compassionate communities where society shares responsibility for care, grief, and support. During the 20th century, death slowly disappeared from everyday life. In the past, people often died at home, surrounded by family and community. Today, death is usually managed inside hospitals and healthcare systems. As a consequence, many people have little emotional and existential preparation for illness and dying. This creates fear, confusion, and avoidance. People are often uncomfortable when speaking about suffering, limits of the body, and finitude. Unfortunately, this difficulty is also present inside healthcare education. Many students in medicine, nursing, psychology, and other health professions receive technical training, but very little preparation about death, grief, and existential suffering. As a result, healthcare professionals may feel emotionally unprepared when facing terminal illness, communication with patients, families, and end-of-life care. This can produce stress, burnout, emotional exhaustion, and communication problems. The lack of education about death has important social consequences. Very often, patients and families expect medicine to defeat death completely. When this is impossible, frustration and anger may emerge. In many countries, we are seeing increasing violence against doctors and nurses. Part of this violence comes from unrealistic expectations and from the inability to accept human limits and mortality. For this reason, education about death is not only a psychological issue, it is also a social and ethical necessity. Social psychology helps us understand why we tend to avoid death. One important model is terror management theory. According to terror management theory, human beings experience a deep conflict. On one side, we naturally want to survive. On the other side, we know that we will die. This awareness creates anxiety and existential anguish. The theory calls this process mortality science, meaning awareness of death. When mortality becomes psychologically present, people activate defense mechanisms. Terror management theory explains two main kinds of defenses. The first are proximal defenses. These are immediate strategies used to push death away from consciousness. For example, denial, avoidance, distraction, obsessive control of the body and wellness, addiction, and compulsive behaviors. The second are distal defenses. These are symbolic systems that give meaning, identity, and hope. People search for cultural values, religion, ideology, nationalism, or social belonging in order to feel protected from death anxiety. However, these defenses can sometimes create intolerance, discrimination, and conflict. Physicians and healthcare professionals are repeatedly exposed to mortality science because of death and dying experiences, suffering and helplessness, difficult ethical decisions on end of life, grief of patients and families, emotional overload, and relational stress. Without adequate emotional and existential training, this exposure may lead to psychological distress and professional burnout. During the COVID pandemic, we conducted a qualitative study involving Italian and international pathologists, including Professor Cristina Basso, in order to investigate the psychological impact of constant exposure to death and autopsies. Participants described fear of death and trauma, emotional overload, moral distress, loneliness, and lack of psychological support, the need of continuously manage emotion while working with corpse. All participants agreed on one fundamental point. Pathologists and healthcare professionals need specific emotional and existential preparation in order to cope with repeated exposure to death and suffering. The study highlighted the importance of psychological support, death education, and reflective space within healthcare training and clinical practice. Psychological distress deriving from the contact with death is caused by compassion fatigue, that is, emotional exhaustion, caused by prolonged exposure to suffering and caregiving demands. Vicarious grief, that is, accumulated grief experienced through repeated patient losses and identification with families. Secondary traumatic stress, or vicarious trauma, that is, trauma-related symptoms emerging through indirect exposure to traumatic experiences. Moral distress, distress arising when professionals know what would be ethically appropriate but cannot act accordingly because of institutional, legal, or organizational constraints. Burnout, that is, chronic occupational exhaustion characterized by emotional depletion, cynicism, and reduced professional efficacy. The fact prolonged exposure to such forms of suffering may produce significant psychological and physical consequences. This form of distress are often associated with chronic stress and emotional exhaustion, insomnia and sleep disturbances, anxiety and depressive symptoms, irritability and emotional instability, feeling of helplessness, hopelessness, and guilt, relational problems and social withdrawal, reduced professional satisfaction and sense of meaning, increased risk of substance abuse and compulsive behaviors, psychosomatic symptoms, burnout, and intention to leave the profession. Now we see protective factors. Research suggests that healthcare professionals are better protected when they develop emotional literacy, reflective and contemplative practices, grief processing spaces, supportive teams and supervision, compassionate communication, existential and spiritual awareness through death and grief education programs that help them remain emotionally present without becoming overwhelmed. For 20 years, I have developed death education and grief education programs. These programs should be understood as a form of primary prevention aimed at promoting death literacy within society and healthcare systems, while fostering the emotional, relational, cultural, and existential competencies needed to face illness, dying, grief, and care. Their goal is to encourage emotional expression, reflection, empathy, awareness, and compassionate communication. Grief education can be understood as a form of secondary prevention. Its goal is to help people recognize, understand, and manage the pain caused by loss. Contemporary culture often promotes a fixing logic, meaning the idea that suffering should be removed, avoided, or solved as quickly as possible. As a consequence, grief is frequently denied, silenced, medicalized, or socially isolated. However, grief cannot always be fixed. Loss is not a problem to eliminate, but a human experience that needs recognition, presence, and relational support. Grief education promotes emotional literacy, compassionate listening, tolerance of vulnerability, the ability to remain emotionally present in situations of suffering. Its goal is not to remove pain, but to help healthcare professionals, patients, families, and communities learn how to stay with pain without being overwhelmed by it. In psychology, contemplative studies are becoming increasingly important. These studies include meditation, mindfulness, compassion practices, reflective silence, and existential awareness. Research shows that contemplative practices may reduce anxiety, improve emotional regulation, and enhance empathy. They can therefore be particularly valuable in death and grief education, healthcare training, and clinical situations in which mortality salience becomes particularly intense. According to terror management theory, imagining some form of continuity beyond death may help reduce death anxiety. My research shows that people who perceive death as annihilation often report higher levels of hopelessness and existential distress. Conversely, people who perceive death as a passage tend to report greater resilience, hope, meaning, and acceptance. For this reason, it is important to recognize the role of philosophical reflection, spirituality, existential meaning, and the role of contemplative practices in psychological well-being. Suffering people need hope and meaning in order to face mortality. However, healthcare systems must remain inclusive and intercultural. For this reason, in death and grief education programs, it is not appropriate to propose specific confessional religious education. Instead, it is necessary to focus on the spiritual dimension of human experience. Spirituality can include meaning, connection, values, transcendence, compassion, and reflection about existence. This approach respects different cultures, beliefs, and identities. According to Rita Charon, narrative medicine integrates all these dimensions and helps physicians improve empathy and communication, understand existential suffering, strengthen the physician-patient relationship, tolerate uncertainty and emotional complexity. Narrative medicine encourages physicians to narrate and reflect upon their own clinical experiences. Through shared storytelling and group discussion, they can process grief, emotional burden, ethical conflicts, and vulnerability. Research suggests that healthcare professionals are better protected when institutions provide reflective debriefing spaces after patient death, peer support and teams-based emotional sharing, supervision, and mentoring, narrative and expressive practices, mindfulness and contemplative approaches, grief education and death education programs, opportunities to acknowledge and ritualize loss, training in compassionate communication and emotional regulation. The Lancet Commission on the Value of Death calls for restoring the relational, social, and the community dimension of care. In this perspective, compassionate communities represent a concrete public health response, promoting healthcare systems that move beyond institutional boundaries through collaborative territorial networks integrating formal and informal social systems, including families, schools, voluntary associations, faith communities, and civic organizations. Their goal is to promote death literacy and develop relational infrastructure supporting dying, grief, caregiving, and social connectedness. In conclusion, death literacy is not only about death, it is about life, relationships, communication, empathy, and human dignity. Learning how to face mortality helps healthcare professionals become more compassionate, resilient, and capable of supporting patients and families. However, achieving the goal of the Lancet Commission on the Value of Death requires not only essential training for healthcare professionals, but also the involvement and education of the entire community. In this perspective, healthcare systems can become centers for promoting death literacy, collective awareness, social connectedness, and shared responsibility in care and compassionate communities. Here you can find bibliographic references. Thank you so much for your attention.